I'm hoping that our audience is as flexible as John Reed is. We are unable to locate Alex Gorsky at the moment, and I know many of you have come specifically to hear this interview, and I apologize for the change. On the other hand, I really am so grateful to John for stepping in, and so this is going to be completely extemporaneous, but I think it'll be interesting. And John, I don't have your bio with me, so I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, and say a little, and then I do have some questions, also extemporaneous for you.
Yeah, well, this is the biggest surprise I've had in a while. You know, I was just sitting in the back having a coffee, and I got tapped on the shoulder. So no apologies if I, not exactly what people had in mind here. Alex, of course, is such a, accomplished, legendary big pharma CEO with so many milestones in his career. So I'm as disappointed as you are that I'm sitting here right now. At any rate, yeah. So I guess the reason they tapped me on the shoulder is because I'm now with Johnson & Johnson, but it's only been about 6 or 7 months. I'm now the global head of research and development there for the what we call innovative medicine sector. As you may be aware, J&J just went through a transformation where we had traditionally been a 3-pillar company with pharmaceuticals, medtech, and consumer health. And now the consumer health has been spun out just a couple months ago as Kenvue, and we're now a 2-sector company with medical tech and innovative medicines. So really an honor and a pleasure to join the J&J team. Before that, I spent 5 years running R&D for Sanofi, based sort of splitting my time between Paris and Boston, although probably it's one of those things, where I asked for a U.S. assignment, but I was in Paris a lot more than I was in the U.S. So, and then before that, I spent 5 years in Switzerland working with Roche as the head of research and early development. And before that, about 20 or 25 years in academic and research institute environments where, I had the opportunity to work with the venture community and start companies and serve on the boards of public NASDAQ companies and sort of learn parts of the corporate world and entrepreneurism in that context. And during all that, we were often partnering with large pharma and always thought at some point, well, what it would be like to go over to that side. And so I've been doing that now for about 12 years and loving every minute of it.
Terrific. Well, John, I want to have a private conversation with you. These people are just eavesdropping, and there are a few hundred more online. And so you've had a very illustrious career. I'd love to hear from you what events or which parts of your career best prepare you for this really huge job you have in terms of running global R&D and such a diverse mandate from J&J for drugs for the first world, drugs for the developing world, et cetera. So what are the things that prepared you the best?
Well, I would say, starting off life as, your typical academic professor type, I think it was really the aspiration to translate discoveries from the lab to products and the mechanism to do that, starting companies, working with companies, and putting together with the help of business experts, lawyers, et cetera, business plans, raising money with venture capital, learning intellectual property management, things like that. That kind of got me going. One of the best experiences I had, I was on the board of board of directors of 5 different NASDAQ companies, and it was an opportunity to learn corporate strategy and how to manage P&Ls and things like that at a much more sophisticated level, et cetera. Did Alex show up?
Alex has shown up.
Oh, good.
You can join it. John, you join us and correct Alex.
All right, very well.
I would offer to do push-ups for being late, but John could do many, many more. So I won't even try to do that.
Yeah, that's what I've learned is one of our common passions is we're sort of exercise nuts, and we make sure we get in the gym or do something like that every day without fail, no matter how little sleep we've had or no matter where we're traveling.
Well, John, as I tell my wife, you could be addicted to worse things, so it's not a bad thing. I apologize. The tunnel traffic was not my friend this morning.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to do a reset here, and we're going to run a little later, but Alex, I'm very glad to see you, and we're going to improvise. We're having, as I said, a private conversation with a group of eavesdroppers. I'll introduce you a bit and say, Alex Gorsky, I think everybody here knows him. I'm just going to pick a few highlights. A 35-year career as a leader in the industry, was until last year CEO of Johnson & Johnson for a 10-year span, during which there are many of the things that he did that transformed the biopharmaceutical industry. He kind of opened the aperture on disease prevention and behavioral diseases at J&J. He made a rare change to a very famous credo of J&J dating back to 1943, added language on treating the whole person and their life experience. Is a champion for diversity, inclusion, and equity, and a new model for R&D with a global network. And many people are calling on him for his sage advice, including IBM, Apple, J.P. Morgan, his alma mater, West Point, Wharton School, etc. So illustrious career, and we're really honored to have you here. I know you've been at the Galien many, many times. So I'm going to ask you the same question that I started asking John, and that is, tell us, I've just picked some highlights, tell us kind of your story, your career story, and if you could mention some of the things that, in retrospect, were your best preparation for being a CEO of a global company.
Certainly. Well, first of all, just let me say how honored and humbled I am to be here with you, and the fact that we are all here today really celebrating science, innovation that's focused around the patient at a time when we all know that there's still so much unmet need. But I would also argue at a time when my 35-year, almost 40-year career, I can't remember a time where there was so much promise. In really thinking about how we fundamentally change the path of disease going forward. And I guess I would start with one of my first memories of being in the industry was in the mid-1980s. And for those of you that don't know, I actually started as a sales representative. And I had a chance to serve in the Army, and I started my career that way. But at that time, it was really just when HIV and AIDS was unfortunately, being realized. And I think at that time, if you were diagnosed, if I remember the numbers correctly, on average, you may have 2 years to live. And in the fear, my wife was an ICU, CCU nurse at the time, and we had just been married, and I remember her coming home quite upset. And they had a patient that we're doing some very, rapid movements with, and she actually slashed her glove and pricked her finger, and was obviously quite concerned because she understood that she was, treating and helping and supporting an HIV patient. So in a very real, personal way, those things suddenly collided and touched our lives. And then I fast forward 35 years later, and much due to many of the researchers in this room, people like John, people like Paul, so many other companies, billions of dollars of research, public-private partnerships, while we certainly have not cured the disease, it is now basically a common disease or chronic disease for many who can get the right treatments. And I think it's indicative of, not only the change and the contributions that have been made by science, but also the promise that we have going forward. And being able to watch and participate and help guide some of that along the way has just been incredibly rewarding.
I wanted to change the subject a little and ask you about the culture of J&J, because I think many people think of it as more than a corporation. It's like a great American institution, yet this corporation does a lot of acquisitions, and you bring in an infusion of other people who have had a different culture. And John, you could chime in on this as well, which is how, in the face of doing that, growing in that way, how do you maintain that special culture?
Yeah, it's one of the most challenging aspects of as you grow a large organization, is how do you maintain those same core values? And I would argue not only how you do that in the United States, but how do you do that when you're growing globally as a country and you're crossing cultural, let alone political and other divides. And look, in my case, I was incredibly fortunate to join a company that had a long-standing set of values and principles called our credo at Johnson & Johnson that was written by the son of our founder almost 80 years ago, that really had articulated a commitment. And you might listen to it today and say, well, of course every company, has got something up on the wall. But when this was written, it was like 1940. And it talked about, hey, our principles are a commitment to patients, to the mothers and fathers who use our products, to the employees to make sure that you're treated with dignity and respect, and to our communities where we work and serve, and ultimately to a shareholder who've invested their capital. And today we know that as stakeholder capitalism. In those days, though, it was a kind of a Johnson & Johnson credo, and I was fortunate to join that kind of a company. And what we find is, why technology and science and business may change over years, those principles we try to hold very true to. And what I can also tell you, and John can, I'm sure, elucidate on the science side. I mean, we're always trying to look for the best science. Where is there unmet need? We try to be agnostic about the sourcing internally and externally. We want to be the best partner. But in addition to just very deep due diligence on those facts, the other area that we spend a lot of time on is the culture of the company. And frequently what we'll say is, now these are our principles, but what we also gain in addition to science and technology is also innovation, different ways of thinking and doing things, but we all try to bring into the domain of those, very foundational principles.
Yeah, just to build on that, and again, I'm a newcomer to J&J, but I've been really impressed with this credo-inspired culture. And if you haven't read the credo, go online. You can find it. It's hard to believe that 80 years ago it was written. It was so prescient. But, as they say, culture eats strategy for lunch. And so I think this idea of having a common set of core values, a common understanding of what behaviors we expect, it seems simple, but, having worked in a couple large multinational companies, I can tell you how rare it is to have a unifying, homogeneous culture, common set of understandings, and how powerful it is, too. I refer to it as our superpower at J&J.
But when I was at Merck and we would acquire a company, sometimes I would look at its culture and say, well, I wish that they would partially infect us, because they had, especially if it was
Otherwise you have an immune response. that happens too.
Very, a small biotech company that may have had, some attributes that were really admirable. A strong core culture often, doesn't really allow for the infection, and sometimes the infection would be very bad. Is there a protocol? Is there a conscious thing that needs to be done when you're looking at another company and you're going to bolt it on to a J&J?
We do a couple things, because I agree. I think it's easy to talk the talk. Walking it is much more challenging. And, one of the things that we do, for example, when we do a major partnership or acquisition, we go in with the company, we'll do what we call a credo session. We'll go in, we'll sit down with the management team, we'll try to be in groups of about 20 people, and we'll literally go through that line by line and talk about why is it important in our company, and how we want to work together to bring it alive. We actually use examples where we haven't lived up to it. change the names to protect the innocent, but what we talk about are, here's things and how or what could we have done better? Because it's one thing to talk about values kind of at a very high macro level. It's another when you really bring it down to say, wait a minute, you're going to do this or you do that. How do you make a better decision? How do you get other people involved? And then we ask all 150,000 employees every year how we're doing. And we actually break that down to the team level and provide that as feedback to our leaders and managers and use that as a way to think about how we're doing in terms of keeping those principles alive.
And how about corporate social responsibility that doesn't have a profit associated with it? You've got responsibilities to shareholders, but to society, which is what corporate social responsibility. How do you balance that? How do you think about that?
And unfortunately, like many things in this world, we can get so polarized about our ideas on, what is the role of capitalism, what is the role of business around the world, and again, I feel incredibly fortunate. When I was a member of the Business Roundtable about 4 or 5 years ago, the executive committee of the Business Roundtable, led by Jamie Dimon, approached me and said, look, if we look at the statement of the purpose for the Business Roundtable, which represents the largest companies, certainly in the United States, but even those that are global, and if you went to our website, it still said that the purpose of the corporation was to maximize shareholder value. And we were being criticized, rightfully so, externally, saying, well, wait a minute, you say you're doing all these things, but then if I go to your website, this is what it says. So he said, Alex, take a look at that. Let's fix it. We did a lot of work, and I'll be the first to admit, one thing I looked at, I stole shamelessly from the J&J Credo, was how do we think about constituents, stakeholders more broadly? And we did actually revise it to be much more consistent, to talk about customers, to talk about employees, to talk about communities and shareholders. And, and sometimes people, when you have that discussion even in the company, they'll say, well, but isn't this just all, we should really be doing this, A, B, and C, and whatever happens with the shareholder. And we would say, no, it does say the shareholder. So it's not an either or, it's an and. And I think anybody that's been in a major leadership role in an organization knows that's the way you do lead. To ever think, I think it's kind of a red herring argument. And I'll never forget the day that we went out. I was actually criticized by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and The Economist. So I knew we probably got it right.
Badge of honor.
But look, I do think it's incumbent upon business leaders, especially today where I think expectation among so many stakeholders, and to think in those domains. And ultimately, that is the best way for the long term to manage a company in a sustainable way that can have, I think, significant impact and performance.
Great. John, I want to ask you about risk and your view of risk. Companies like J&J are looking for innovation and for breakthroughs. And then generally, at least in my experience, they set up internal committees to de-risk the project. And, it's hard. There's an inconsistency about getting a breakthrough and taking risk. You're in a role you've had before, but in a new institution. How do you go about judging what's a risk worth taking? How do you go about allowing for taking a big risk to get a breakthrough? We'd love to get your insights on that.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say I'm waiting for the AI people to come up with an algorithm for that. So, they can take all the judgment and guesswork out of it. It's never perfect, but I think it starts first with really understanding what is the unmet medical need, what is the opportunity, what would, if successful, is there truly a practice-changing opportunity to elevate the standard of care and not just, let's say this is called incremental innovation, but an opportunity to really do something special for patients. So if you start with that as the possibility, then simply applying, I think, as objectively as you can, that truth-seeking mindset of understanding the risks and the opportunity, but then recognizing that, you know, there will always be risks, there will always be gaps, and that's part of our job, is to try to take smart risks. I think in general, we and me personally, we at J&J and me personally, in terms of the way I approach these things is, you know, I would generally prefer to take a risk on something early, and in doing so, you can usually get it cheaper than to wait for something to be fully baked, and then, you know, everybody is trying to buy it, and it costs an arm and a leg, so to speak. So I think calculated early risks, recognizing that if you have sort of a portfolio view of that, some of those will come through, and they'll be the next big innovations of tomorrow.
Alex, I wanted a global company with products that are being sold all over the world, different standards of living in different places, different prices for the same product. Is there some pricing model, and of course pricing's under enormous scrutiny more than ever in the U.S. now, but is there some pricing model or some principle that can be applied to rationalize this across the globe?
Well, I'm not sure that there's just one overall solution. And I think we all have to start from the premise of the reason we're in this industry. I think it starts with, how do we better serve patients? How do we better meet unmet medical need? It's about, how do you bring great innovation to life? How do you source it? How do we put it through the rigorous development regulatory processes to make sure that, you know, we understand the efficacy, the safety, the applications of these things in the best possible way? And then I think it's about taking a responsible approach to pricing. It is a complex issue, but it starts with, one, what is the difference that you're actually making? What does the data look like that you have supporting it? What kind of an improvement over existing therapies does it actually represent? And then, of course, what kind of potential in terms of other applications that does it have? And I think doing that on a global basis is important, because every company is dealing with different pricing mechanisms, different pressures within them. And look, I think there's clearly room for improvement. And, you know, getting to a point where we can improve access through better pricing mechanisms, where we take more of an outcomes-based approach than just a utilization approach. But I don't underestimate the complexities associated with that. Putting in the right incentives, and frankly, in certain cases, clearing the pathway around things like biosimilars in generics in an appropriate way, so that, frankly, we free up funding to be investing in other areas. Sometimes I think, people think large pharma is somehow against that, and I think in many ways, if you're a large innovation-based company, you want to make sure that there's a reward for innovation. And that's done by appropriately applying those standards on the other side of the continuum as well, for product accessibility. And then I think there are certain areas where we have to come up with programs, as the industry does, but we need to continue to push that even further in areas that simply can't afford, where we need to make sure that patients can get access.
I think I'll ask each of you this final question, then we can honor the schedule as much as possible for the next one. You're both lived in the C-suite and have brought your own training and skill set to that. Now, kind of looking forward, are there things that need to be added to the skill set of either a global head of R&D or a CEO that you think really we need to focus on for the future and then the generation after you in these leadership positions? John.
Well, stating the obvious, I think, is that more and more, I believe, being at least conversant and knowledgeable about data, machine learning, AI is becoming a prerequisite now for operating in many different roles, including in the C-suite. So I think this is an emerging area that will become more and more part of what it takes, I think, to really operate with competitive intensity, et cetera. So I'd say it's probably the main thing that I could point to, but I would also, particularly coming at this from a science side, where you can kind of run in esoteric crowds and things like this, is really developing the EQ along with the IQ, and that ability to relate to people at all levels and all roles. As I grew up in little farming communities, doing lots of blue collar work, working on farms, baling hay, stringing up barbed wire, shoveling manure out of barns. Spent a summer working in the coal mines in West Virginia to make, money to get through college. And those kind of experiences are so invaluable because, they just taught me to be able to relate to and appreciate anybody in any role, and, really taught me that all work is noble, and to never be so proud to think you can't learn something from the lowest person in the organization. So I just think those are incredible skills as well that I really value in my own career path.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. Thank you, John. Alex, please.
It's hard to top that. John, in addition to our passion for some of those other things, I didn't realize we actually share a very common background in the way we grew up. Sometimes people think, well, every CEO happened to go to Harvard or, this school or that school. And more often than not, what I found is it's the opposite. They come from pretty simple backgrounds, actually. The only other thing that I might add to that is I just think that the expectation on leaders, not just our research and development leaders, but business leaders more broadly, about knowing when, where, and how to weigh in on some of these other issues that we talked about, I think that the bar has been raised there. 10, 15 years ago, it would be if you're a leader, keep your head down, don't get involved. Some people would criticize it now, say that's, wokeism or this. But I think the reality is that business does touch so many aspects of society. We represent employees who, by and large, represent society. And I think that there's an expectation, and I want to highlight in the appropriate way and in an authentic way for business leaders as well as businesses to participate, to engage in that discussion, because I think that can actually help get to better outcomes overall. And I think having being comfortable and finding that voice is important for leaders now and in the future.
Terrific. Well, hasn't it been great to have these two unexpectedly on the audience? Thank you very much.